I began to feel a cold sweat as that thing crossed the highway. It was a slaughter. My soul winced and squirmed with every shriek and cry from those pigs in that pen. Then it all went silent.
That was a taste of what's to come in today's episode of Alone in the Woods, the podcast where real people share their scariest outdoor encounters, and I narrate them. Today's episode is all about those terrifying things hunters sometimes stumble upon when fate isn't going their way. Send us your scary outdoor experiences at eriecast.com/outdoor. Catch these scary stories and more on the Darkness Prevails YouTube channel. Now, throw a log on the fire, because the night is still young. I shot a deer. From Campy Creep. This was years ago now, but I remember it, all of it. I loved the forest, and I loved hunting, but not so much anymore. That night, the moon was full, but the trees choked its light. Streams of silver fought for every inch, peeking through the canopy. Footfalls in the forest echoed, and the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs announced my presence. I wasn't lost, but I had not found what I was looking for. Earlier that day, I had shot a deer. It felt wrong. That's the best way to explain it. Just wrong. I'd had no luck, sitting in my stand for hours. But then it walked out of the tree line. A huge buck. It strolled right to the center of the clearing, head pivoting side to side and then up. It looked straight at me. I took aim, lining up my crosshairs on the deer, when suddenly, a voice in the back of my head whispered, "Don't do it." Why? I thought. Just don't take the shot. The voice insisted. I lined up my crosshairs again. The deer didn't blink. Its glassy black eyes stared up at me. I think it knows I'm here. Why isn't it running? My chest started to tighten. I don't know, but don't do it. The voice continued. I curled my finger around the trigger and began to squeeze. The voice was screaming now, warning me not to do it. I knew I shouldn't have pulled that trigger, but I did. God, what I'm saying doesn't even make sense. But it's what I saw, it's what I did. I shot the deer, and it didn't budge. It took that bullet between the shoulder blades, like some sort of mosquito bite. It flicked its ear, licked its nose, turned its head, and walked back to the gap between the trees, vanishing. I climbed down the tree stand, approaching the spot where the deer had been hit. There was blood, but it wasn't right. The wound I had made in the deer's chest was mere moments ago, and yet the blood on the ground was already clotted and dried. I followed the blood trail into the trees. The smell, oh God, it was horrible, like the stench of swamp mud and rot. Something was off, but I had to track it down. My dad had instilled in me strong hunting ethics. Know your gun, shoot only when certain, and always track down wounded game. I can't explain why I felt the way I did. Watching it walk back into the woods made my stomach drop, but why? My inner voice returned. It wasn't a deer, and it saw you. It took that bullet like a slap on the back. Then what was it? I don't know, but it wasn't a deer. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of summer. The chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, frogs joining the chorus on cue. Everything was in motion. I followed the blood trail, refusing to give up for the night. I had to find it. Suddenly, the trail stopped at the base of a large tree. The blood had been heavy and constant up to that point. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Where could it have gone? Then something thick and sticky struck my forehead. I reached up, touched it, and brought my fingers into the light. Red. Blood. I shone my light up into the tree, and there it was. Halfway up the trunk, more blood. Further up, on one of the branches, more blood. What the heck? That's not right. I tried to rationalize. Had the deer succumbed to its injuries? Had it been dragged up the tree by something else? No, there wasn't enough blood for that. And there were no remains. How did blood get up in the tree? It must be from another wounded animal, not the one I'm tracking. Perhaps I got swapped onto its trail instead. But that can't be right. I knew I was tracking the same trail the entire time. The only explanation is that the deer, that thing I shot, scaled this tree. Deer don't climb. So where is it now? I shone my light into the treetops, but there was nothing. The branches were bare, no sign of life anywhere. Crap. Now what? I decided to make camp since the trail was dead. There was nothing left to track. I set up my tent and gathered some wood for a fire beneath the tree. I tried to get some rest, but sleep would not come. I kept replaying the events from earlier over and over again. The more I thought about it, the less anything made sense. And the less sense things made, the more threatened I felt. I sat up, stoking the fire, and grabbed my weapon. I was ready to fight. Not ready to win, perhaps, but to fight. "What are you doing?" a voice in my head asked. "I just want to be ready," I replied to myself. Ready for what? I'm not sure, but it makes me feel better. No, you know what. You shouldn't have shot that deer. Sitting by my fire, I remained at the ready, constantly scanning the area, listening to every sound the forest threw at me. The night was loud. The forest was alive with creatures all caught in a perpetual state of hunting or hiding. Then faintly, I heard a snapping sound. I turned and raised my gun toward the void. The orange glow of the fire danced on the barrel, illuminating the campsite, but revealing nothing beyond it. I decided not to use my flashlight. I wanted complete control of the weapon. Motionless, I sat there, listening very closely. Nothing, just the crackling of the fire. Yeah, that's all it was, just a crack of the fire, I told myself. Nothing out there? I knew that wasn't true, but it was the only thing I could say to convince myself to lower the gun. The night dragged on, but I survived, despite the occasional kamikaze moth pelting me. As dawn broke, the cool morning air, tinged with a light blue hue, enveloped the forest. It was a welcome change from the heat that lay ahead. A thick fog had rolled in. I extinguished the remnants of my fire, packed up my gear, and prepared to head to the pickup location. My friend wouldn't be able to get me for another day, but at least I'd be ready. I squatted down to retrieve my packed bag, slinging it over my shoulders in one swift motion. The swirling fog parted where the bag had lain, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. Tracks. Not just any tracks. Deer tracks. Hundreds of them. The hoof prints struck deep into the damp ground around the campsite, forming a perfect circle around my camp. This thing had been circling me all night long, just beyond the firelight. But that couldn't be. I would have heard something. I mean, there were hundreds of tracks. It would have had to make noise at some point. As I looked closer, it became apparent there were no tracks showing entry or exit from the area. It was like the deer had simply materialized right beside the campsite and vanished when it was done. Forget this. I'm out of here, I muttered to myself as I began the long trek to the pickup location. However, I decided not to stop there. I would hike down the logging road to the mouth of the main dirt road that my buddy would have to drive down to get to the meetup spot. Honestly, it didn't do much in getting me out of here any sooner, but it was good to have a mission to work towards. Any amount of time shaved off in these woods was better. Most of the hike was uneventful. I was approaching well over halfway to the meeting spot when I decided it was time for a break. I rummaged around in my bag for water and a protein bar. I was making great time. At this rate, a few more hours of hiking and I would be on the logging road in no time, and only a half-hour hike from the main dirt road. A branch popped behind me. I lifted my gun and swung around to the noise in one fluid motion, scanning the area. The forest is thick this time of year, so my view of my surroundings was limited. This thing could be mere feet away, and I wouldn't see it. The iron sights of my rifle glided across the forest, and then stopped. I saw something. A big patch of brush, but something was off with it. At the top of a large bush, there were weird branches coming out, oddly bare. No, they weren't branches, I realized. They were antlers. My hands tightened around my weapon as I pulled its buttstock tight against my shoulder. Tunnel vision kicked in. I saw nothing aside from that bush. Then I guessed where the head would be relative to the exposed antlers. I took aim, and I squeezed the trigger. The kick of the gun jolted my insides. A loud, thunderous bang ripped through the forest, followed by the burnt smell of gunpowder. It didn't even flinch. No movement at all from this thing. The tips of its antlers were still visible. Then the exposed point slowly lowered down, out of sight, into the brush. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. Everything was wrong. I grabbed my bag and began to run, as fast as the forest would let me, towards the direction of the logging road. Tearing through the woods, between the snapping and whipping of vines and branches, I could swear I heard something tailing me. But I didn't care. I just wanted out. So I kept running. I burst through the thicket and into open air, the resistance of the forest vanishing, toppling me forward onto the dusty red earth. An orange cloud surrounded me as I slid across the dirt road. I rolled over, facing where I'd exited the tree line, chest heaving, waiting for that thing to rip through the foliage and jump right on top of me. But as I sat on the road, gun up, nothing came from the woods. The forest was still. I think I'm losing my mind. I lifted myself up from the dirt, brushed off my clothes, and gathered my bearings. It's this way. I started down the dirt path, hiking for a few minutes before a section of cleared forest came into view on the right side of the path. It was an old logging site, stumps jutting out like headstones in a tree graveyard. The clearing was littered with the tracks of trucks and the branches of past harvests. It was a wide-open expanse of mangled wood and debris. This is as far as I go for now, I thought. The sun will be going down in a few hours, and there's no point in going further. Plus, this will make a great spot for camp. The best parts were an abundance of firewood, an open view of my surroundings, and the ground being completely littered with branches, so I could hear anyone or anything coming. No trees mean no cover for it from my shots. Yeah, this is as good as it gets. One last night, and my buddy will be here first thing in the morning to get me. Just one more night. For the last time, I set up camp, stacking a quick pile of firewood and standing guard as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night crept in from the forest around me. I could sense I wasn't alone. The feeling had been lingering before dusk, but now it was closer, more persistent. The hours passed slowly. The wind was relentless, constantly threatening to snuff out my flames. I kept shifting my position to shield the fire with my body, but it was barely enough to keep it lit. The darkness was thicker than the night before, with no moon or stars, only clouds blanketing the sky and its light. It was quieter tonight. There were no sounds of bugs or animals, just the rustling trees and howling wind. Time dragged on with nothing happening. Dawn was only a couple of hours away. I made it, I thought. Maybe I am losing my mind. Then I saw it, a silhouette approaching my camp. The fire cast a faint glow, but I couldn't make out any details. It looked like my friend, my buddy. Maybe he's ahead of schedule, I thought, and he was drawn by the light of my fire. I stood up to greet him, but froze mid-stride as the figure moved closer. The darkness around it melted away. It wasn't my friend. It wasn't even a man. The legs were far too skinny. The arms hung at odd angles, and what looked like long hair rose from its shoulders in writhing lines above its head. As it stepped into the light, I saw it clearly, every horrifying detail. It was that deer, but not a deer at all. This thing continued walking straight towards me. It moved on its hind legs like a man. The forearms, now drooping in front of its body, ended in claws instead of hooves. Its jaw hung loosely on its hinge, revealing rows upon rows of jagged, malformed teeth. Its antlers, now more resembling tentacles, whipped at the surrounding air, and its eyes, no longer on the sides of its head, had shifted somehow to the center of its face, one atop the other. I raised my gun, took aim. Then something from the sky hit my hand, then my cheek. It ran down my face and off my chin. It was beginning to rain. The sky opened up, unleashing a downpour that extinguished my fire in mere seconds, plunging me into darkness. The last sight I had of this thing was it advancing towards me. I fired my gun in the dark. The flash from the discharge revealed nothing of its location, but I saw my flashlight on the ground to my left. I could hear nothing over the ringing in my ears from the shot. Even the beating of the rain was lost on me. Keeping my gun raised, I bent down with one arm outstretched, feeling around the ground for my flashlight, until I touched the familiar smoothness of plastic against the rough earth. I grabbed it, and as I did, I felt fur brush against my outstretched arm. I swung the gun in that direction and pulled the trigger. The recoil threw the gun from my hand, and I felt something warm and sticky splatter across my face. Clutching the flashlight, I dug my feet into the ground and pushed off into a sprint. I clicked on the light and picked a direction, the rain beating against my face, washing sweat into my eyes, making them sting. Each falling droplet obscured more of the light, leaving me barely enough visibility to keep my footing. I ran and ran until I hit even ground, the light illuminating the muddy path of the dirt road. I continued down the path until I lost my footing, sliding in the mud. The flashlight bounced ahead of me, landing with its beam pointed back in the direction I'd come from. I rolled over onto my back and saw a tall, shadowy figure running up the path towards me. Scrambling to my feet, I left the light where it lay and let my instincts guide me. I didn't stop running until my footsteps slapped against pavement. I'd made it all the way to the main highway. The sun was beginning to rise over the trees. I walked along the side of the road until I heard a familiar voice call out behind me. "Hey!" I stopped and turned to see my buddy, half hanging out the window of his truck, a look of concern and confusion on his face. "What the heck happened to you?" he asked, hopping out of the driver's side door. I paused and just stared at him, unsure of how to explain. How could anyone understand? I finally said the only thing that made any sense. "I shot a deer." It Stalks Us. From Ed 103. This is a full, up-to-date assessment of my encounters with what I believe to be a skinwalker. These experiences are old and new alike. It all started about 1.5 years ago in my old house, now condemned by the owners for some reason unrelated to us. It began with seeing a weird dog in the backyard on our off-brand Ring doorbell. Unfortunately, my mom didn't keep any videos of it. This escalated to odd noises from the bamboo that I'll refer to as the woods or the brush. It was a very strange sound that no animal, to my knowledge, should be able to make. I know the animals in my state. I'm a hunter. I hunt small game with my Daisy Powerline 880. On another occasion, we heard the noises again. My little brother and I would carry BB guns at night when walking the dog, Finnegan. Usually, he's a violent but loyal dog. He's some breed I don't know, and he looks more like a goat if you ask me. Usually, he rushes towards anything alive. But this was different. He wanted to go back inside. So we did. On one occasion, I heard a scream that echoed throughout my neighborhood at 4 a.m. It sounded like a woman with PTSD. Eventually, I heard something similar to it, which instilled me with terror and made me freeze. We were walking the dogs that day. We had a German Shepherd puppy who was overly confident and barked a lot. We were heading back home, and I had to unload my rifle. The bolt on my BB gun was magnetic and required something else to remove the BB. My nails were too short, so I shouldered the rifle, aimed, and fired it into the brush. A violent shriek suddenly erupted, something from the depths of hell. I ran to my mother's room, grabbing her pistol, a Beretta PX-4 Storm subcompact. I slammed in the nearest mag and racked the slide, checking the chamber to see if it picked up the round. I called my mom, who was out on a date at the moment. She didn't believe my story. She even laughed. So I hung up and took matters into my own hands. I grabbed some sage and lit it. In one hand I had the Beretta, and the other, the sage, much like how a police officer holds his flashlight. I rounded the corner to the large sliding glass door to see almost pitch-black darkness. But I could make out something walking back into the brush. I had never felt more terror than that moment. I couldn't breathe. There was definitely something out there. Something that wasn't human. My mother came home, but before that, I removed the magazine, emptied the chamber, and turned on the safety. I even cleaned the fingerprints off the shiny metal magazine, placing it back in her bedstand. My mom returned to see me and my brother hiding in the corner with our BB guns and knives. We were later evicted and had to move our things. While walking our dog Dolly, the German Shepherd, I heard something call my name from the brush. It was distorted, like it came from a terrible radio or something. I nearly had a heart attack. I probably would have been the youngest guy to die from one. We went and lived in the country for a while, with my mom's cousin. I packed up our BB guns one day and decided to go hunting. We walked a few meters in. It was dead silent. The only thing I could hear was the ringing in my ears. We sneaked our way back to the cabin, and all was well. On the final night before we moved into our new house, I looked out the cabin window to see that thing with its back turned towards the small stream. Some moonlight shone to show brown and black fur, It was standing a bit like a person, but it was definitely not one. I should mention I am not religious, but I am partially native. That night, though, I got down on my knees and prayed to every single god I knew. We woke up in the morning to our mom command. That fear changed his mind. We moved into our new house in early January 2024. Just before that, during Christmas, I was gifted some night vision goggles and an airsoft AK-12. As for my mother, she bought her first rifle in February, a .350 Legend Savage Axis II. My brother and I explored the golf course nearby at the apartment complex. We found these odd footprints in the mud, a combination of wolf or dog and deer. We booked it out of there and talked about it for a few days. A few weeks went by. My little brother and I took a night operation, basically a night walk in our gear, to the golf course with my NVGs. We found even more of the strange footprints near the small artificial pond. As we stood there, the air suddenly felt warm, and we didn't feel alone on that desolate, empty course, so we ran all the way back home. I've met someone who understands me and has had similar experiences. She's like the sister I never had, and talking to her has helped me deal with my PTSD. I still have nightmares about that thing breaking through the glass, or what might have happened if I'd started shooting. Now, if that thing ever comes near me, it's getting a .350 Legend round lodged in its skull. Update. We saw it again. My brother and I were walking as usual, going to check the golf course. That day it was closed only to golfers, so we ran back to the house and dressed in richer attire. I grabbed my bag, putting in my airsoft Walther PPK with 8 rounds in the magazine. We grabbed some golf balls and tees too, in case we did get caught, a 7-iron and 9-iron, and some gear ran out. Except as I looked at it, it didn't look like a deer. This thing had the tail of a fox. We continued walking, both on edge. We looked around the corner, but it vanished, leaving no evidence behind. We continued our walk, keeping our heads on a swivel. All seemed to go back to normal until we saw that deer again. This time, it was staring at us. I noticed something even more strange then. Its eyes were that of a wolf's. My brother noticed it first, and we played it off like it was a normal deer. But my hand was in my bag, gripping my Walther, with the safety off. We walked away from that thing, keeping a good distance until we saw some golfers in sight. We kept walking, acting like random golfers. I shot a glance behind my back at one point, and that thing had already vanished. Thankfully, we got away unscathed, but scared. We won't be returning anytime soon to that golf course. The Howl, from Night Ruler. My name is B. I'm 27 years old and I'm from Wisconsin. I've grown up hunting and fishing my whole life. This story takes place back in 2019. The names in this story will be abbreviated. I'll call my girlfriend F, my cousin A, and my friend P. This happened around Labor Day weekend at my family cabin on our 11A streetlight from my vantage point. This detail will be important later. I've camped in those woods for years, seeing deer, raccoons, skunks, and coyotes. That night started fine, like any normal night. We all sat around the fire, talking and hanging out. Around 11 p.m., we decided to go to bed, so we crawled into our tents. My girlfriend and I went into ours, and P and A went into theirs. Lying in bed with my girlfriend, I noticed it was extremely quiet. Not creepy quiet, but calming. I woke up hours later to A or P snoring loudly. Annoyed, I just tried to go back to sleep. and I guess my frustration woke my girlfriend. That's when we began to hear coyotes across the way from our property, on the other side of the highway. They were going crazy, yipping and barking. But that does happen from time to time. F asked me if we were okay, if we were safe. I told her that there was nothing to worry about. It was then that P and A woke up, asking if the coyotes were close to us. I said no. They're out across the field. Then, out of nowhere, this loud guttural howl sounded on the road near my cabin, probably 150 yards away. My girlfriend grabbed me, saying, "Babe, what was that?" I told her I had no idea, but it wasn't a wolf or a coyote. Then A yelled over,
"Was that a wolf I just heard?"
I said, once again, I had no idea. So I got up and unzipped the flap of my tent to look out the screen. I didn't see anything at first. I then looked out towards the streetlight and stop sign, and that's when I saw it. Now, before people start saying it was a wolf, I've seen and I've heard wolves. This was bigger. This thing was massive. It would make a wolf look like a German shepherd. The creature looked like a wolf but twice the size, with long dark hair and a huge bushy tail. Its back was arched, as if the front legs were shorter than the back. My eyes grew wide with fear, and I began to feel a cold sweat as that thing crossed the highway. I heard it go into the woods, crashing and breaking things as it went through the brush. I don't know if it was a werewolf, dogman, or skinwalker. I can't be sure. But I do know that it wasn't normal, and everything went silent after it passed. Darkness prevails here. Just want to say thanks for listening this far. You've made it halfway through. If you like what you hear, would you mind following and rating Alone in the Woods on Spotify and Apple Podcasts? Or perhaps subscribe to Darkness Prevails on YouTube. Thank you. Now back to the stories. Warning. The following story contains depictions of severe harm against animals. Werewolf and Feral Hogs. From Mississippi Pigman. You can't go through Mississippi without experiencing the Mississippi River, blues music, catfish, gators, and southern hospitality. Besides the warm, welcoming culture, it sits upon marshy lands, thick pine forests, and the Gulf Coast. You can call me Sean. This is where I was born, raised, and still live to this very day. This is my story. I am an avid hog hunter and trapper. For those who don't live in the South, we have a bad problem down here with invasive pigs, or feral hogs. These pigs are big, mean, carry diseases, breed quickly, and can be difficult to trap. They cause millions of dollars in property damage by destroying yards and farmlands, and they ruin ecosystems. I've been affected firsthand by these critters, and I've made it my priority to help reduce these pests and the devastation they cause. I own a property outside of a small town called Purvis, and there on my land is where I do most of my hunting and trapping. When I trap, I like to use large corral traps, because, from experience, they work the best. The one I own is a large remote-activated one that sits next to a camera. First, I bait the trap with corn, then I wait. When the camera picks up movement, it alerts my phone, and I can see then if there are hogs in my trap. I can push a button, and the walls come down, trapping them inside. For those who want to do the same, I have a boar buster. The thing works like a charm. My personal best is 19 in one catch, so if you beat that, consider yourself a champ. I tell you about this trap because of my first experience with what I think was a werewolf. It was about 1 year ago in July. In the summer down south, it's hot and humid. with temperatures reaching well into the 90s and higher, depending on the humidity. That day was hotter than the son of a gun. I was at my property, and it was getting dark. I was in the middle of eating supper when my phone lit up with a notification. It alerted me that my trap had some activity. I quickly got up and checked it. I saw 13 hogs eating the corn I'd set out. 2 sows, both with 5 piglets, and 1 juvenile. I waited patiently as they all slowly got to the middle. Then I hit the button as the wall slammed down into the dirt, trapping them inside. I remember saying, "Gotcha, mud sacks," as I was grinning from ear to ear. I set my phone down, grabbed my .22 rifle, laid it on my table, cleaned up my supper, and I got ready for bed. Come morning, I was going to take care of those pigs. As I was getting ready for bed, I remember putting my phone on charge on my nightstand and hopping into bed when my phone alerted me that there was more activity at the trap. Being curious, I checked to see if there were more hogs I could potentially spot and stalk the next morning. What I saw on my camera was straight from a horror film. I noticed and heard that the hogs were going absolutely nuts. Then on the camera, I saw a large, hairy creature on all fours creep up to the trap from the dark. At first I thought, what the heck is a bear doing here? There are black bears in Mississippi, but you don't see them much where I live. I then looked at it more closely, and I realized the shape was all wrong. I thought it was a large, dark coyote, because coyotes are everywhere here. That's rare, I thought, but then again, I compared its size to the trap. I then thought of the R.L. Stine Goosebumps book, Werewolf of Fever Swamp, and I thought it looked like how it was described in the book from what I remembered as a kid. My eyes went wide with the realization, and a wave of terror and concern began to creep into my mind. I was watching this live as this very large black wolf-like thing circled my trap. I noticed its head and how it looked like it had a coyote head but much bigger. I noticed how built this coyote werewolf creature was and noticed that it had some serious muscle mass to it too. I then saw its hands and feet, and I say that because it had human-like hands with claws like knives protruding from the fingers. Its legs were just like a dog's with a backward joint. At this point, the pigs were constantly to the far side of the cage, the exact opposite side this werewolf thing was. Then, if things couldn't get any more bone-chilling and frightening, I watched it stand up on 2 legs. It then hopped on top of the trap like it was nothing. Keep in mind, this trap is about 5 feet tall. It was almost double the height of the trap when it stood up and jumped on top of it like it was the easiest thing in the world. What happened next, I'm going to keep brief. But I did watch for the couple of seconds it happened. Unfortunately, I didn't turn the audio off. What I saw and heard was the absolute worst thing I'd ever heard and seen. It was a slaughter. My soul winced and squirmed with every shriek and cry from those pigs in that pen. Then it all went silent. My hands and body were shaking. I had this primal fear wash over me. My blood went cold. I was in utter shock and disbelief at what I just witnessed. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were glued to the screen. I watched this creature put what was left of a sow on its shoulder, the other sow in its jaws, and the juvenile in its claw, as it again hopped the cage like it was nothing and disappeared into the forest. I couldn't speak. Words just wouldn't come out. I didn't want to move, or maybe I just couldn't. My eyes were locked on my phone screen, frantically searching and anticipating something else to happen. I genuinely feared that if I moved, it would come for me. I stared at that trap for several darn minutes, waiting, watching, listening for anything to come back. Luckily, that werewolf creature didn't come back that night, and I got no sleep at all. I didn't even bother trying. I made sure to lock every door and window. I got out my SIG P229 and sat on the couch with it by my side till morning. When the sun finally rose, I waited till it was bright and sunny. Then I loaded up my Polaris, driving out the couple of minutes to the trap. I left my .22 and instead brought my AR-15. I had the safety off the entire drive. When I arrived at the trap, I slowly got out of my Polaris, AR raised, finger on the trigger, and I slowly walked up to the trap, scanning my surroundings, my ears strained. At one point, I noticed I was holding my breath. Every step was planned and carefully placed as if my life depended on it. I finally got to the trap, and my stomach clenched and turned as I saw the red scene laid out in front of me. There was nothing left intact in that trap. You can probably imagine what I saw. But to help, picture everything with a bucket of dark red paint on it. I thought to myself, whatever that thing is, it's a killing machine. I very quickly and quietly raised the trap walls to allow for other animals to clean up the mess. As soon as I finished, I had an awful feeling of dread come over me, and the hair on my body began to stand up. I quickly decided it was time to leave, so I did just that, returning home as quickly as I could. After that day, nothing else happened for a while, and the unease began to disappear until the end of August came around. By then, the weather began to cool just a bit, and one day I went out to a feeder I'd set up to put up a trail cam and spot some deer to see what bucks I could potentially go for the upcoming deer season. I arrived at the feeder, loaded it with corn, climbed into a nearby tree stand, and waited for the feeder to go off. About 30 minutes later, the feeder went off, and not too shortly, a group of 5 hogs came wandering in, grunting, uprooting things, being noisy as they began to feed. I was annoyed because I left my .22 rifle in the Polaris, just below the tree, and I knew if I went down to get it, I would scare off the pigs. But then I realized I did have my SIG P229, and I decided that would have to do the job today. I slowly and quietly brought it out of its holster, flicked the safety off, and aimed. As soon as I was about to pull the trigger at the biggest hog of the group, a large black hairy mass sprang out of the forest. It was so fast, so unexpected. I flinched hard and almost dropped my gun onto the stand. It was a blur that happened within a matter of seconds. The black blur ran out of the woods, grabbed a pig, and knocked over my feeder, all in the matter of, no joke, less than 3 seconds. I was in such shock and disbelief, my mind went blank. There was no thought, no anything, besides what the heck just happened. I was then hit by the sudden realization that this was the werewolf thing I saw about a month prior, and it had run right out in front of me. That same primal fear came rushing back into my mind as I sat motionless in that tree for about an hour. I dared not make a sound, or even breathe, if not necessary. I was so scared, even blinking seemed loud. All that time, my mind was spinning with questions. Like, how hadn't I seen it before then? Or, did it see me? Did it know I was there? Could it have gotten me if it wanted to? If I had to, could I protect myself? Is it still out there? I kept running through different scenarios in my head. Eventually, after I felt the coast was clear, I felt safe enough to get out of the tree. I climbed down that tree like a monkey, sped home, and didn't stop until I was back at the house. After that day, it's been hard to go back outside without being paranoid, knowing that it's still out there, and that none of my guns in my possession make me feel any better. It's been over a year now. I haven't seen it since. I'm still trapping and hunting on that very land, but now I always keep in mind that that werewolf thing is out there, and that the feral pigs, and now I have something that we always have to watch our backs for. Warning. The following story contains depictions of severe harm against animals. Trees of Flesh and Bone. From TX Diver. This happened in the early 2000s. I was taking my son Tyler on his first deer hunting trip. We live in East Texas, and I've been hunting these woods since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I never had any real trouble before. Just your usual peaceful trips out in nature. But this time, man, I still get the cold sweats thinking about it. It was perfect weather for deer hunting, in my opinion. Tyler had just turned 13. I figured it was high time he learned the family tradition. We packed up the truck on Friday after school and headed out to our usual spot. It was about a 2-hour drive from my home, a nice, secluded area, part of a large privately owned ranch where we have permission to hunt. The owner of the place is an old family friend, and we've been coming here for decades. We arrived just before sunset, enough time to set up camp and go over the plan for the next day. Tyler was excited, chattering away about how he was going to bag the biggest buck in Texas. I just smiled, remembering my own first hunting trip with my dad. We had a simple dinner of beans and hot dogs cooked over the campfire, then turned in early. We wanted to be up before dawn to get to our blind. That's when things started to get weird. It must have been around midnight when I woke up to the sound of Tyler shuffling around in his sleeping bag. "Dad," he whispered, "you awake?" "I am now," I grumbled. "What's up, bud?" "I think I heard someone outside." I was about to tell him it was probably just the wind, or some small critter, when I heard it too. A sort of scraping, scrabbling sound, like a whole lot of something moving around out there. I unzipped the tent and poked my head out. I had my flashlight in hand. What I saw made my blood run cold. The ground around our campsite was covered in tracks. Hundreds of tracks, all coyote from the look of it. Now, coyotes are not uncommon in these parts, but I'd never seen sign of so many in one place. And there was something else, too. Dark patches on the ground that looked suspiciously like blood. I tried to play it cool for Tyler's sake. "Just some coyotes passing through," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing to worry about. They're more scared of us than we are of them." But as I zipped up the tent, I wasn't so sure. Something about this felt off. Way off. We tried to go back to sleep, but it wasn't easy. The night seemed alive with sounds now, rustling in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig. And then, around 3 a.m., it started. The howling. Now, I've heard coyotes howl before. It's a common sound out here. But this was different. It started low, almost like a whimper, then built into a crescendo of the most gut-wrenching, pain-filled cries I've ever heard. It sounded like dozens, maybe hundreds of animals, all crying out at once in absolute agony. Tyler was shaking like a leaf. Heck, I was too. We huddled there in the tent, listening to those terrible cries for what felt like hours. I kept my rifle close, though I knew deep down it wouldn't do much good against whatever was out there. Finally, as the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the cries faded away. We must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, the sun was up. I'd love to say we packed up and left right then and there. That would have been the smartest thing to do, but I guess I was trying to salvage the trip for the sake of Tyler. Or maybe I was just fooling myself, trying to pretend everything was normal. "How about we do a little scouting?" I suggested, over a breakfast that neither of us had much appetite for. "Maybe we'll find a good spot for tomorrow's hunt." Tyler nodded, but I could see he was still spooked. Truth be told, so was I. We packed some water and snacks and headed out. I told myself we would just do a short hike, maybe an hour or two. Then we would head back to camp and decide what to do next. The woods were quiet that morning, too quiet. No birds singing and no squirrels chattering. We'd been walking for maybe 45 minutes when Tyler suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "Dad, what's that smell?" He held his nose. I'd been so lost in my thoughts I hadn't noticed it, but now it hit me like a truck. The stench of death, so strong it made my eyes water. "Stay behind me," I told Tyler, raising my rifle. We moved forward slowly, following that awful smell. We pushed through a dense patch of undergrowth and found ourselves in a small clearing. That's when we saw it. All through these years, I've been turning this over in my mind, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a rational explanation. What we saw in that clearing was like something from a nightmare. Coyotes, hundreds of them, hanging from the branches of the trees surrounding the clearing. But they weren't alive, they weren't whole. They'd been skinned, their raw flesh gleaming wetly in the dappled sunlight, filtering through the canopy. Some were fresh, blood still dripping to form dark pools on the forest floor. Others were in various states of decay. The smell was overwhelming. I heard Tyler retch behind me, and I wasn't far behind. But the worst was the eyes. Every single one of those skinned coyotes still had their eyes, and I swear to God, they were looking right at us. I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I grabbed Tyler and ran. I know we crashed through the woods with no regard for direction, just desperate to get away from that clearing. By some miracle, we found our way back to the campsite. We didn't stop to pack up. I just grabbed the keys and my wallet and got in the truck. I don't think I'd ever driven so fast before. We were home before noon, and I spent the rest of the day holding my wife and trying not to fall apart. We never did go back for our gear, never reported what we saw, because when I told it to myself in my head, it just sounded so bizarre. And what would someone be able to do anyway? I told the ranch owner we'd had some kind of stomach bug and had to leave early. I think he knew I was lying, but he didn't press the issue. About 6 months after this, I ran into my old hunting buddy, Garrett, at the hardware store. We got to talking, and I don't know why, but I found myself telling him what happened, but not in a lot of detail. Just that we had a scary experience out at the ranch, and I wasn't sure I'd be going back. Garrett got real quiet. He looked around like he was making sure nobody was listening, then leaned in close. "I never told anyone this, but something weird happened to me out there too, maybe 5 years ago." Garrett went on to tell me that he'd been hunting out alone one night when he saw something in the sky. 3 lights, arranged in a triangle, hovering silently over the trees. He said they stayed there for maybe 10 seconds. Then there was a flash of light so bright it left him seeing spots. When his vision cleared, the lights were gone. I told myself it was just some kind of military craft, Garrett said. Convinced myself I was imagining things. But the next morning I found hundreds of tracks all around my campsite. Looked like coyote or dog prints. There was a weird smell too, like ozone or rotting meat. Garrett said he packed up and left right then. I couldn't bring myself to put it into words, but as he was talking, I felt this cold certainty settle into my gut. Whatever had happened to those coyotes, whatever had made those god-awful sounds that night, it wasn't natural, and I don't believe it was human. Tyler and I don't talk about what happened. Not to each other and not to anyone else. I still hunt. Not out at the ranch, but in other places. Normal places where the worst thing you have to worry about is twisting your ankle or startling a snake. But I'm always watching now, always listening. Nowadays, the howl of a coyote in the distance really awakens something in me, makes my heart skip a beat. To all you fellow hunters out there, be careful, watch the sky, and if you ever find yourself in the East Texas woods and you hear coyotes crying out in pain, run. Run and don't look back. Thanks so much for tuning in to Alone in the Woods. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on Twitter at Dark Prevails and hear more scary stories from me on my other podcasts, Unexplained Encounters and Tales from the Break Room. Or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Darkness Prevails. Check out my tabletop card game I made, based on cryptids and folklore. It's available for pre-order right now at cryptidcardgame.com. If you enjoyed the show tonight, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and a rating on Spotify to help us grow. Thank you. Before I go, I'll read and reply to a fan comment. This one was from my Twitter. It's from @HutchOfTheDead.
What's your earliest memory that you can recall, that you knew the unexplained, supernatural, and Darkness Prevails was a passion you knew you wanted to pursue, as more than just a hobby or interest?
I've been into the paranormal forever. Loved catching spooky shows on TV when I wasn't supposed to and asking everyone I met about their weirdest encounters. When my own brother had a very real-sounding and emotional account to share of a werewolf, then the deal was sealed for me. As for Darkness Prevails, I began to take the channel seriously when my Krampus Facts video went viral. Yep, my YouTube/podcasting career took off thanks to freaking Krampus Facts. Leave a comment on my YouTube channel or tweet at me, and I'd love to reply to one of them at the end of my next episode. Be sure to let me know which show you're from. Thank you. I'll see you all soon, when the campfire blazes once again.